Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk Free for All Friday. Talking about the story of Esther, and maybe you'd want to weigh in on that, 888-589-8840. Just some of the lessons out of the story of Esther, where all she really had to do in this circumstance was speak. That was the challenge. Here was a situation where she could remain silent or she could speak. She didn't have to organize anything. She didn't have to go door to door. She didn't have to campaign for something. She didn't have to organize anything. The calling on her life at that point was simply to speak, to make her voice heard. And she experienced this tremendous sense of intimidation to remain silent out of self-protection. And again, doesn't mean we're supposed to speak in every single circumstance. I'm not saying that. But here was clearly a circumstance when God was telling her, look, in this situation, you must speak up. And Mordecai says, look, if you remain silent out of fear and cowardice, you may think it's a path of safety, but it isn't. If you keep silent, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. So remaining silent when we should speak may seem like the path of safety, but it is not. It is actually a path that creates long-run, long-term risk. And that's kind of what we're seeing with religious liberty in America, in my judgment. The Christian church has been silent for far too long, and now our religious liberty is being eroded at an accelerating pace. And that's because the church remained silent when it should have spoken. Now, this may, where you need to speak, it may be in a school. It may be speaking to a teacher about what you find to be an objectionable assignment. It may be speaking to a principal about an objectionable decision that is made, something that's tolerated, something that's celebrated in the school. And courage for you may simply be going to the principal and registering your complaint, speaking instead of remaining silent, and then maybe sharing your concerns with other parents in that same school. A lot of good things have happened. I've been reading a number of stories about policies that have been reversed, objectionable policies that have been reversed in schools simply because parents have spoken with a united voice to administrators. But here's the opportunity. I mean, here's the thing that I think is important to understand is that Mordecai says to Esther, look, if you keep silent, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. In other words, Mordecai says to Esther, look, God's will is going to be done. He is going to see to it that relief and deliverance come from another place. So God's will be done. The only question is, will his will be done through me? Or is he going to have to go find somebody else through whom to speak because I shrink back in fear? You know, and she says, if I perish, I perish. And I think that is got to be the mindset of the believer. The man and the woman that God uses is the one who is willing to risk everything, literally everything, to follow him. And you may have been in a situation like that where the thing you know you've got to do contains tremendous risk. It may represent a risk to a relationship that you cherish. It might represent a risk to your job. Your job may be on the line if you speak rather than remain silent. It may be putting at risk a relationship even in your own family, a cherished relationship. And if you speak the truth, you know that it could result in a breach in that relationship that may never get mended or may take years to mend. And what do? Do you speak when God tells you to speak, or do you shrink back in fear, hoping that there will be some kind of deliverance or protection in remaining silent? And as we see with Mordecai's word to Esther, it rarely, if ever, works out that way. Silence now simply means trouble later. All right, 888-589-8840 if you'd like to kind of respond to that, weigh in on your personal experience with that. In fact, let's grab a call or two while we've got them on the line. Let's go right to Dennis in Texas. Dennis, welcome to Focal Point. What's on your mind?
Thank you for taking my call, Brian.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the work that you do. I just want to say that I was actually in my girlfriend's church last Sunday. Had never been there, and she kept telling me how good the ministry was. So I actually wanted to find out for myself. And I get there, and I'm kind of in shock because there's a woman pastor, and I kind of believe, like the Book of Corinthians, women are called to preach or the pastor. So I'm kind of just grown through the whole service. Although what she said was good, I didn't feel like she said anything harmful. But after church, she kind of greets everybody, and she asked me why was I looking so solemn, and I just kind of told her that I believe what God inspired man to write in Corinthians, that women are not called to preach, and that they're actually commanded not to even open their mouth in his house. And she told me that only applies to the Corinthians, and I told her that means the book of Romans only applies to Romans and so forth and so on. I believe that she's wrong, but I'm going to get off the line. I kind of want to hear your view on that.
Yeah. Well, listen, I appreciate your courage and your boldness. She invited you to speak, so it was entirely appropriate for you to share with her what was on your heart. So no breach of protocol there because she asked for your thoughts. She asked for you to share with her. And I completely I agree with you. The Bible is very clear about this. In fact, Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, I, as an apostle of Jesus Christ, speaking with all the authority of Jesus Christ, I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. So what Paul says, when it comes to life in the church, the roles of opening the Scriptures, explaining the Scriptures, expositing the Scriptures, that's something that in God's economy is reserved for males. That's a part of leadership that he's entrusted the responsibility of males, and also the exercise of authority in the church. Who's in charge of this area? Who has ultimate authority in this ministry, this area? And Paul says in the church, if it's a mixed group, then the authority ought to rest in the hands of men. So if you have a mixed group, male and female, coming together to be instructed out of God's word, Paul says that instruction ought to be done by men. Now, it doesn't mean that women cannot teach. It doesn't mean that women cannot teach. If you have women that come together to be instructed and invigorated and mobilized, it's absolutely perfectly appropriate for women who have the gift of teaching to teach in those formats. So we're not saying that women don't have the gift of teaching, that they're not smart enough to teach, that they don't have the depth in the Scripture to be able to teach. We're not saying anything about that. This is simply about what is appropriate in God's economy. And he says when you have mixed genders, adults, when you have mixed genders, then when the Scriptures are opened, the opening of the Scriptures ought to be done by men, and the exercise of authority ought to be carried out by men in God's economy. So you simply need to ask the question, if it comes to the role of women in the church, there's just two. It's very simple. It's not rocket surgery. You ask two questions. If I put a woman in this role, does it put her in a position where she is instructing men, where she is teaching men? If so, then the answer is that's probably not biblical for us to do that. Or does it put a woman in a position where she is exercising authority over men, where she is telling men what to do? Once again, that's not an appropriate role for women to place in the church. Larry Crabb had a great observation about this one time, about why it is, because I'm convinced when God sets up these rules, they're set up for our protection. They're not good for some people and bad for other people. A lot of people look at this and they say, well, yeah, it's good for men, but it's bad for women. They're being repressed. They're being held down. They're being restrained, whatever. And again, we make this point repeatedly. We see male and female as absolute equals in worth and value and eternal significance before a God. No difference in value or worth. This is simply a difference in the roles that God has assigned us to play. Complementary roles, equal in value, different and complementary in role. And what Larry Crabb, the point he made is, look, if you have a woman teaching men, what is going to happen at some point is every teacher is going to be challenged. So at some point, if a woman is teaching men, she's going to be challenged on something that she says, something that she teaches. Just as you, I think, in an entirely appropriate way, challenged this woman with the way in which she was carrying out her ministry. Entirely appropriate, because she asked you to share your thoughts. Now, what happens is a teacher's got to respond to that challenge. You've got to meet that challenge. And you've got to meet that challenge with an appropriate display of strength and assertiveness. I'm not saying aggressiveness. I'm not saying something bad, but that's got to be met, especially if what you're teaching is right and the challenge is coming from a place that's not good. Well, here's Larry Crabb's point, is every time a woman is in that position, we don't want to put a woman in that position because she's going to have to respond to that challenge with strength, and it's going to diminish her femininity. She's going to have to do something that's kind of masculine nature, assertive, aggressive, and she's going to have to compromise a little bit of her softness, a little bit of her femininity in order to rise to that challenge. And that's not a good place. It's not good to put a woman in a place where one of the two choices she makes is going to compromise the femininity that God has designed for her to display. One of the differences between men and women that I see is God has designed women to create an atmosphere of embrace, of hospitality, of warmth. That's why when I was a pastor, I discriminated on the base of gender in hiring. Absolutely. I make no bones about it. I discriminated on the basis of gender. I wanted a woman to be the receptionist. I wanted a woman answering the phone for my church because a woman has a gift by God to create an embracing atmosphere, a welcoming atmosphere, an atmosphere in which arms are open to receive. There's a softness there. There's an invitation there. And that's the kind of tone that I wanted set by the receptionist in our church. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question. I want to make one other point about 1 Timothy 2, because, your point is exactly right. If that was just for the Corinthians, well, then Romans is just for the Romans and Ephesians is just for the Ephesians. But Paul in 1 Timothy 2, where he says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man," that would just be for the Ephesians. So it'd just be the Corinthians and just the Ephesians. But what Paul does when he substantiates his argument, he goes all the way back to creation. In other words, this isn't cultural. It is transcultural, because to substantiate his argument, he says, "For Adam was formed first and then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor." So in other words, this is transcultural. This goes back to man and woman as they were created by God, designed man for leadership and women to respond and support and follow that leadership. Focal Point, AFR Talk.
Leanne Williamson of